Hey everyone, this is my final project for the Cornell Cooperative Extension Permaculture class. It's also for the Finger Lakes Permaculture Institute Design Certificate, and this is called the West Bluff Food Forest. It's my property in New York. So let's start with why this place. You can see the little house here on the right. In 1996, my mom's parents, who we call Nan and Pop, bought a cabin on the east side of the Bluff of Cuca Lake. We call that place Flanagan's Landing. It's this big peninsula here. And every summer, basically, my family's gone to this place. And it's the most important holiday for that family. It's part reunion, part holiday, part birthday. It's just amazing, really special place. So basically, I've spent my whole life during summer hiking and biking and learning to forage berries and fruit and herbs all along the slopes of the bluff here. So in 2018, my parents actually purchased that home as my grandparents downsized. So this place is a multi generational home, a really special spot. Um, and someday my brothers and I will also inherit it. And it has room for my parents and for us and for my grandparents. So in 2019, I saw 15 wooded acres for sale about 10 minutes up the road from Flanagan's Landing. That's the second house here. And I toured the property and decided to purchase it. And so begins this project. As you can see, it's really beautiful here. These are various parts of the property, some of my favorite places. There's a log cabin on it, a lot of basically just old growth forest and some clearings. So here are those places. The oldest growth forest is down here. The big clearing is this whole area, and the log cabin is down here on the south side of the property. So generally, the property's about 15 acres, which is two lots of 7 acres each, mostly wooded. It has seasonal access by a dirt road, which is really tough to get down in the winter. We basically just don't even try. There are neighbors. You can see their driveways in this map. But it's pretty private. It's a lot of land, and being at the end of the dirt road really lends itself to a lot of privacy. So let's talk about the goals. Permaculture has three major ethics: earth care, people care, and fair share. And I use these symbols here in these next slides about my goals for this property as they relate to the ethics of permaculture. So the first earth care goal is to care for the fertility and the health of the soil, water, creatures, and plants now and for 7 generations to come. And the way that I plan on doing that is building and preserving soil fertility, using nitrogen fixing plants to balance soil chemistry as Mother Nature does, and in that soil growing perennial foods to produce an abundance of nutritional food. I also think it's important to be a steward and protector of the Cuca Lake watershed. My property drains directly into the lake I grew up going to, Cuca Lake. So the water systems that I build will help regulate rainwater in both drought and flood, and moving water throughout the hill with ponds, basically water systems to make sure that all of the water leaving my property is healthy and clean, and then sustainably managing the forest for firewood and for tree crops, and just keeping the forest healthy with my touch, growing basically in harmony with the forest and mimicking the mature forest systems in nature. The people care goal is that the site provides healthy food that can support myself, my family, my community with food sovereignty all year. And in relation to this food, we rebuild a culture that connects people with our ancestors and our food. So the heart of this property is the kitchen, which doesn't exist yet, but this is one of the goals. Uh, there'll be a large gathering table so that individuals and community can be fed around this table with the delicious food grown right here. Building culture as we raise and harvest animals like ducks and hunt deer, learning how to use the entire animal for food and for clothing and for crafting, which is an old skill that I want to reconnect with and bring people to reconnect with. And as we grow tree crops like maple syrup, black locust trees, apples and peaches and pears, berries, ginseng and cohosh, all of these things, eventually I would like to get to the point that I can sell these at a farmer market or in a CSA, to be able to make a living, to live on this land full time, and basically be able to support myself. The fair share goal here is teaching the principles of permaculture to visitors in word and in action, and ultimately showcasing abundance and reconnecting people with the land to care for them as well. So generosity is basically how we conduct ourselves, feeding the people and winning folks' hearts with meats and eggs and veggies and fruits. Any guests that I have are invited to stay and provided with the abundance. Teaching interconnection, so showing how systems depend on one another in a given meal is something I care a lot about. So bread and nuts and mushrooms and eggs are all part of these systems that we're going to talk about in a minute here that benefit from one another and rely on one another. And most importantly, for fair share, I think the living world is acknowledged and thanked at every meal. We live in harmony with the hillside, and we constantly keep nature in our gratitudes, acknowledging that that is the true source of our abundance, and that we're basically keeping our fair share in mind by sharing that. So let's talk about the actual site. These are a bunch of exercises that we did to assess. We used Yeoman's scale of permanence. So each of these categories we're about to talk about is sort of the most permanent down to the least permanent, and that's important for calibrating the changes that we can make. First thing here is climate. So this is a map that I drew, kind of going over some of the microclimates, like where there's a ton of light here versus shaded forest. The wind kind of comes up the lake here. There's 33 inches of annual rain. The microclimate thing is pretty interesting here, as well as the directions matter. So the summer sun is this entire northeast to northwest, and then the winter sun is going to be southeast to southwest on a given day. The microclimate is super interesting around Keuka Lake. So there's actually a 5-degree difference if you're around the lake, and this property is right on the border. I think the border is a little arbitrary, so it'll be very interesting to see the closer you are to the lake, the more this microclimate affects it, to the tune of 5 degrees on average, which really changes you from a zone 6 to a zone 5. So that will have a big effect. To summarize, it's mostly wooded, very temperate climate. Microclimates do exist around the property, and there are the microclimates formed by Keuka Lake. We also get 33 inches of rain on average, so we ran some calculations during the class, and this actually means that 3.136 million gallons of water run through the property. Definitely something to be leveraged. Landform is basically the structure of the land. So the cabin here, there were a lot of earthworks done to build it there in the 70s. Some as well on the north and the south driveway. There's a road here, but the main thing is going to be the western facing slope. So this is the bluff right here. It's basically formed by 2 glaciers that split, so it's a large hill. So everything, my property is basically here, drops about 200 feet facing west, so on average a 20-degree slope. That's downward western facing. And the entire property has that slope, so it's definitely something to consider. As I mentioned, the cabin has some flattened areas that make it easier, and then the 2 driveways north and south. Water, there are these gullies that I showed some photos of earlier, as well as the water systems on the road, which need some work. The road is kind of poorly graded and risks eroding. The driveway also gets muddy, and we've gotten stuck in there. But on the south side is a large gully that flows west, and there's another gully system that comes to the edge of the property here on the west, which is full of storm runoff as well as seasonal snowmelt. So those gullies are well established, which is nice and can be utilized for water. There are culvert pipes, kind of various parts of the property have them, some probably need them, and because of the facing slope, there's a high risk of erosion. Invisible structures, there's 2 or 3 that are kind of important here. Lyme disease, a neighbor who's a little grumpy, and then the fact that I have to share this road. And to summarize, the road is kind of contentious, which will influence my behaviors and the way I handle that. The Lyme disease, it definitely influences behavior. And then the property has 2 lots, which you can't really see on the map, but it means I'm able to potentially to build a second home. Access and circulation, I think, is the main problem of this site. So right now, you can access it easily on the north driveway and the south driveway. But to get here, the only way I've found, because there's this impassable thicket of bushes and trees here through the center of the property, the only way is to really walk through this clearing, past the cabin, down the hill here in this kind of mature open maple grove, and then follow a wildlife trail over that way. And you have to jump over the gully a little bit, which could use a bridge maybe, but access is not as easy as just coming right here on the map. So that's probably one of the main issues to address. Additionally, the property itself is accessed at the end of a dirt road, so in snow, it's very hard to get to. Sloping property makes it very difficult. The navigation issues I talked about, and then the delivery of materials is really hard because the road has a turnaround. Larger trucks that would deliver things can't really turn around there. Basically, just fits maybe an F-150 size car, and you need four-wheel drive to get to it. So that is definitely something to take into consideration. Animals, it might be hard to read this in the video, but there's a lot of deer bedding here. There's nesting areas for other animals that I've seen here in these clearings. It seems like the deer kind of stay clear of there, but the trails here are mostly wildlife trails. And then in isolated woods, I've seen signs of bear and fox and a lot of other animals. The plants, again, old growth forests, a lot of hickory and oak and maple and hemlock. I've seen some mushrooms growing. There's a lot of clover, a lot of crown vetch. Raspberries grow here. I found some wild strawberry here, wild blackberries there, which makes me really happy. This is a maple grove. There's poplar trees and a big dead ash tree right next to the house, as well as one of my favorites. I found an apple tree and definitely ate those apples. So one note on this, these are bubble maps, which is another kind of brainstorming assessment activity that we did in class for animals and plants. The best way around it right now is how the animals get around it. As I've said, I saw bear and fox and eagle, rabbit and squirrels. The plants are pretty mature and isolated forest. The clearings have a lot of sun, and so they have a different growth profile. The soil is pretty uniform. It's mostly clay. This is from the USDA soil survey. Another version of the property map here. You can see the big clearing, and the dot is right on the log cabin. It's these types of soils, generally uniform. The bluff is pretty uniform. It's a lot of clay, as I said, uniform soil composition. That clay holds water, which will be helpful at times for building ponds, but it also means that septic systems, I know, aren't able to be built in clay. So that's got to be considered as well. And building soil on top of the clay is going to definitely need to happen. Structures, not even a summary needed. That's the cabin. There's a shed on the north side. Those are the two structures, basically. The aesthetics is one of my favorite parts. So there's two photos here of these kind of views. So standing at the end of the driveway looking south is this view of the lake. Very beautiful. And then this is a reflection from the cabin, kind of looking at the cabin and back west. A little weird view here, but I like it because it just demonstrates that like this is the lake view. So if you're inside of the cabin, you can see this beautiful lake sunset, which is important to preserve. Because the property is basically raw land, I think that preserving this view is one of the most important parts, and I'm taking that into consideration. The old growth forests I want to leave. Those are rare and beautiful and really a pleasure to spend time in. So those are the aesthetic considerations. To summarize, tons and tons of forest to the point where I didn't even draw it. We drop about 200 feet in vertical across the scope of the property here. We have this shared road along the east side, and then driveways on the north and south, cabin right here, these gullies, and some wildlife trails. That's pretty much it as far as summarizing what the property looks like now. So let's talk about the actual permaculture design, the output of this class, basically. This is a photo of me in the south end of the property here, this maple grove. So I created this base map, which you've already kind of looked at. It's a digital version that shows the whole property from above. If we're talking about zones, there are two zone zeros, the shed and a future house, as well as the cabin, kind of your home center. Intensive gardens that require a lot of attention will hopefully be here and here. Um, Zone 2, which are kind of forest gardens, are sort of along the road here, as well as the south end of the property. Zone 3, which would be an orchard or pasture land, I think this will be a future orchard site. This will be potentially pasture for animals in the future. Zone 4 is kind of cultivated woodlands, like hands-off stuff, like growing mushrooms. And then wild or wild cultivated stuff is all Zone 5. I love this area and I want to leave it there. And to summarize permaculture zones, it's basically like putting your effort close to your location so that you can basically align those things. And in that design, this is what I've come up with for the property. So there's a lot of elements here. I'm not even going to go into it on this map. Let's just kind of dive into some of these examples. General principles that you can see in the map. Redundancy is a major one. The water systems that I plan on the property are going to come from rainwater as well as these ponds, and I will hopefully drill a well, so there'll be many ways to get water. And then electricity also will come from the grid, allegedly. I haven't turned it on yet, but the new home that I hope to build will also have solar panels. Another permaculture principle is that the problem is the solution. So I took that into consideration in this design because the drastic slope has a lot of challenges, but if you think about it in terms of moving water downhill and building pond systems, if you work with the slope, it will be a huge asset. And that's the design goal, basically, is to work with what we have. So anything that is a problem, think of it as unique and see how we can leverage it. I'll talk about diversity, but that's one of the main permaculture principles. If you've ever seen the movie The Biggest Little Farm, diversity, 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 I took that into account here as well. And then producing no waste. When building trails or when cutting down trees, I plan to reutilize those to build hugel mounds or other things that we'll talk about here. So right below the house is the Keyhole Gardens, this kind of zigzagging path with hopefully a pond, maybe add some ducks at one point. So this is a hugel mound here that is basically woody and a combination of leaves and compost and topsoil. And that is a pretty resilient, holds moisture, holds nutrients type of soil that grows and holds nutrition for 5 or 10 years as the wood breaks down. So that's one of the things I plan to utilize here. I also found this pictured idea that I mentioned. This would be kind of a useful way to maximize space, but also to build some fencing that would protect gardens from animals. The contour gardens, I hope to leverage the fact that there's this southern exposure. This is kind of on the north driveway. I hope to put a new home and maybe some solar panels in this general area. But the contour gardens here, these lines, I would like to build swales, which basically look at the original slope, and excavate soil to build a berm. And then this goes along the contour, so water distributes itself and kind of self-waters for a different garden system. And this garden would be a mix of annual vegetables as well as some perennial plants. Now some patch designs. Let's kind of dig much more in depth to the 3 areas that I think are most interesting: the maple and mushroom polyculture, the orchard polyculture, and some of the wild simulated ginseng, the pharmacy over here. So the maple and mushroom polyculture, on the south end of the property, there's a maple grove. I want to start small with that. I would like to put in around maybe 10 taps to start making maple syrup, and to expand maybe with the property. There's other maple groves, but also with my neighbors, seeing if they would let me tap on their properties. It would be a way to build relationships. But that's down the line. The main goal here is going to be culture building. I think eating maple syrup that's from the land on pancakes is a really important thing, and kind of earning it and reconnecting with the land in the process of creating maple syrup. Also, one of the things that I like that I'll talk about in mushrooms is the combination of forest management with mushroom cultivation. So these sort of mushroom logs are going to be, I think, my first attempt at financial viability of living here. Shiitake mushrooms are very easy to grow on these kind of cultivated logs. Uh, I've heard them described as foolproof. It's at least a good place to start. And then other mushrooms get more complicated. So, oyster mushrooms, really like poplar wood, reishi mushrooms, which are highly medicinal, like sugar maple. And so that's why this is a polyculture. The waste product, quote unquote, waste product from a maple tree that is now too old or has fallen can be reutilized to grow reishi mushrooms here, and all of this is already here. Hen of the Woods grows on oak. Wine caps can grow in these sort of hardwood chips. Here's some examples of like wine caps and some mushroom logs. So the pathway here considers the slope. That's why it zigzags. It contains a little channel to run water down. Um, Longer term mushrooms will be farther downhill. They need to be visited less. And the diversity of mushrooms here are going to help to build a living soil. The permaculture principles applied here is the problem equals the solution. So maple logs, like we talked about, climate change is also something to take into consideration. Maple trees do not do well in warmer climates. So as the climate warms, those maple trees will die, but they could be used as mushroom logs. And then integration over separation. So eventually adding ducks into the system to clean snails off the logs and connecting these. The site goals, building soil and reutilizing waste, and then making delicious food interconnected with this land. So maple syrup, mushrooms, and eggs all would be coming from this polyculture. The orchard, this is probably my favorite. I call it Pop's Polyculture Orchard. So there's an existing clearing kind of in the center of the property. I want to plant between 50 and 100 trees on that, about an acre. So in planting them, I want the trees to alternate. So it'll be apple tree and then a nitrogen fixer and then a pear tree and another apple tree. That reduces pest spread basically. But before I even plant the trees, I plan on planting some raspberry because it's a big open clearing. And deer don't like raspberry because of the thorns. Clover also is a nutrient accumulator, so that could be just chopped down as a living mulch. And also I plan on planting some radishes to break up the clay soil and to help nutrients absorb into it. So before I even plant the trees, there will be sort of this layout here of like raspberry bushes and radishes and clover everywhere. So mixing in some heirloom varieties of apples like Cortland and Northern Spy and Honeycrisp. Yellow transparent apples are one my grandmother grew up eating. Harrow, Delight, and Warren pears, perhaps some stone fruits in here, and then nitrogen fixers like sea berry and autumn olive and wisteria, which are edible and have flowers and are beautiful. So spacing them kind of into these alternating rows that have swales, again to manage water, and then adding in eventually bees and a pond are kind of the things that I see all working together here. So adding bees will help with pollination as well as honey to sell and mead to sell or trade. The cool thing is once the trees grow up, the raspberry bushes won't be happy there anymore because they like a lot of sun. So that will help them from being too invasive. And then building established pathways to move through the orchard will help prevent the soil compaction issues. This is really about stacking functions of both space and time, which is a permaculture principle. So the space is utilized, both the canopy, understory, and herbaceous layers and roots, which when I talked about the earth care goal and mimicking natural forest, that's exactly that. That's how nature does it. And then also it's about stacking time. So the fruit will yield from like year 1 or 2 for the raspberries, and then eventually as it grows up, will move into fruit trees. So there's many yields throughout time. And then diversity is really important. A bunch of different types of apple trees and pear trees and stone fruits will make sure if they're alternating that pests can't just jump tree to tree as would happen in a monoculture. So as it connects to site goals, as I said, self-balancing soil chemistry. People care is important. Just thinking of my family, yellow transparent apples are ones that my grandma grew up eating. And then the orchard is named after Pop, who is the one who originally bought the house. He told me that he always wanted an orchard. So that's the plan there. And then the fair share is basically once there's an abundance of fruit to be sold and shared, I'm going to be baking pies and people can eat it, all that stuff. So the last section I want to dig into here is the wild simulated ginseng, basically a wild pharmacy in this part of the forest. It's the most remote and the most beautiful, so I want to leave it as an old growth forest, obviously. But there's a lot of shade tolerant, endangered, and medicinal plants that I would like to grow. So building a path system through here, and then growing things like American ginseng and black cohosh and golden seal, trilliums, which are just very beautiful, ginger, all of these sort of things that are medicinal and beautiful would go in this area. So the trails is the main thing. As I outlined before, access is really tough, and that's going to help a lot. Um, I'm not going to pretend to have a perfect plan for this. I'm just going to be experimenting and seeing what grows and trying that. There are a lot of long term projects. So, ginseng, that's pictured right here, takes 5 years to be able to harvest. So, it would really be a long term project. So, the permaculture principle here is to observe and respond. I want to go looking for the things I intend to plant. They might already be there. And I would just be planting the seeds that are already there, and then planting companion plants by that. So preserving the old growth forest and working with it here is the earth care goal. And then for people care, for making a living, as I outlined before, ginseng cultivation. I really love ginseng, and there's a big market for wild simulated ginseng, especially one grown in New York locally. So that would be a profitable thing to sell as well, but to do it sustainably, which is most important. So, really quick at the end here, I just want to talk about how this design grows through time. The permaculture zones, as I mentioned, there's two zone zeros. So the cabin is right here. It's not even a home yet. It's a big project, but it will be the center where I can live. And eventually, I want to move and build a new home to the north end of the property on the other lot. So things will shift, and the zones will shift. So in 2019, which was last year, what I've already done, purchased the property, meet the neighbors. I installed a shed here where that arrow is. I marked the property line and I walked around taking all these notes, taking photos. I attempted to mow this lawn. That was a hoot. I mowed it first thing in the morning and it was wet. So I slid not once into this ditch, but twice. I also slid into a ditch here. So my dad and I went to the hardware shop and I got to come along like a crank to pull the mower out of the ditch. That was great. The log cabin was a big focus for this just to make it possibly livable. We gutted the entire thing, which took a couple of weeks, scrubbed all the mouse stuff out, and got it ready for the winter. Last note on 2019, got Lyme disease, which was interesting. So I got treated immediately. I have no other health, issues from it. But I learned that deer ticks are really, really small, like the size of the head of a pencil, not like Missouri wood ticks, which are the size of a pencil eraser. So that's important to know. 2020, pandemic permitting, I think the first thing to begin working on here is the access issues with the trails. So everything here kind of in this purple color are the trail systems I want to build. I want to also plant some cover crops and clear some stuff in the main clearing here, like get this more cleared out. It's kind of overgrown, and start planting some cover crops. Cutting down wood for those trails, basically clearing it out, I'll use to build into hugel mounds and leaf piles to start building soil as it just naturally deteriorates over the years. And then continuing to invest in the log cabin, trying to get the damaged logs repaired, adding wiring and electric power. Maybe, if I have time, digging a pond to kind of see how water holds in the clay throughout the year. 2020, I have all those trails maybe done. What I would like to do is start clearing the intensive garden space here, plant some crops and see how wildlife react to it, see how much of deer browse is going to be a problem, basically. Maybe start drilling a well to get access to drinking water. I plan on that being here where the future home site is. I know it's far from here, but that's the plan at the moment. Building rainwater collection systems, starting long term projects like the orchard and raspberries and cover crops. I could plant some ginseng out here, some wild or some shiitake mushroom logs out here, and just generally keep the land clear and working on it. And I'm not going to pretend to know what the heck is going to happen after that. But I'd like to live here for a whole summer and work remotely. That is definitely possible. I've got a mortgage on this land, so paying that off, finishing the cabin, eventually being able to rent that cabin out would be nice. I can't wait for the orchard to bear fruit for the first time, and then kind of designing what an off-grid home would look like if it were, roundabout there. So that's my permaculture final project. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me on Instagram. That's my handle right there. I'm happy to hear input, to answer any questions, and I appreciate it. Thanks. Bye.